When Shaquille O'Neal was forced off a flight over a bag carrying a dead father's basketball and a little boy's trust, he had every reason to use his fame to fight back. But the quiet choice he made instead would save a woman from her worst mistake and change the way she treated people for the rest of her life. By the time Shaquille O'Neal walked into the small community gym in Orlando, most of the kids had already been waiting for nearly an hour. There were no bright NBA lights, no packed stands, and no reporters calling his name. Just folding chairs, old basketball hoops, a few tired parents, and dozens of kids who looked at Shaq like someone had brought a superhero into their neighborhood. He had already spent most of the day shaking hands, signing shirts, taking pictures, and answering the same questions over and over, but he never rushed the kids. If a child wanted to tell him about school, he listened. If someone wanted to show him a jump shot, he watched. And when a little girl missed 6 free throws in a row and started crying, Shaq stayed beside her until she finally made one. Near the end of the event, the line began to disappear. Volunteers started stacking chairs, parents gathered coats, and someone near the entrance reminded Shaq that he needed to leave soon if he wanted to make his flight back to Los Angeles. That was when he noticed a boy still standing near the wall. The kid looked about 9 years old and was holding an old basketball against his chest with both arms. The ball was scratched almost white in places, and one side had been repaired with black tape. Shaq waved him over, but the boy didn't move at first. His mother gently touched his shoulder, and only then did he take a few slow steps forward. "What's your name, big man?" Shaq asked. The boy looked down at his shoes before answering, "Eli." Shaq smiled and held out his hand, but Eli didn't give him the basketball. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his sweatshirt and pulled out a small white envelope, folded slightly at one corner from being held too tightly. "This is for you," he said. Shaq took it carefully, and Eli finally looked up at him. "My mom says the strongest person isn't the one who never gets hurt. She says it's the person who can still be kind when they are hurting." For a second, Shaq didn't say anything, because those were not the words he expected to hear from a 9-year-old boy. Eli's mother looked embarrassed and started to explain, but Shaq stopped her with a small shake of his head. He crouched as low as his huge frame would allow so he could look Eli in the eye. "Your mom sounds pretty smart," he said. Eli nodded and held the old basketball a little tighter. Then he admitted that it had belonged to his father, who had died 2 years earlier, and that he had brought it because he wanted Shaq to sign it. Shaq's smile faded just enough for Eli to notice. He took the ball, turned it slowly in his hands, and saw an old name written in faded marker near the seam. Instead of signing it right there, Shaq asked the boy if he could take it with him and send it back after he added something special to it. Eli looked at his mother before answering. That ball was clearly one of the few things he owned that he would never willingly lose, and Shaq could see the fear in his face. "I promise you," Shaq told him, keeping his voice low. "I'll take care of it, and it'll come back to you." Eli finally handed it over. Shaq placed the ball inside the large reinforced duffel bag he had carried all day, right beside a pair of game-worn sneakers that were going to be auctioned for charity and a stack of letters other children had given him. Before leaving, Shaq wrote his assistant's number on the back of a program and gave it to Eli's mother. "If that ball doesn't come back, you call this number and make my life miserable," he joked, finally making Eli laugh. In the car to the airport, Shaq opened Eli's envelope. The handwriting inside was uneven and written in pencil, with several words erased and rewritten. Eli thanked him for visiting the neighborhood and wrote that some kids there felt like famous people only remembered places like theirs when cameras were around. Then came the sentence that made Shaq stop reading for a moment. "I hope when I grow up I can be strong without making other people feel small." Shaq stared at those words while traffic moved past the window. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope instead of handing it to an assistant. Then he put it inside the duffel bag with Eli's basketball. By the time Shaq boarded his flight, exhaustion had finally caught up with him. He had been talking, smiling, standing, and giving pieces of his attention away all day, and now he wanted nothing more than a quiet seat and a few hours of sleep. His first-class seat was still small for a man his size, but he had learned long ago how to fold himself into spaces built for everyone else. He lifted the heavy duffel with one hand and placed it in the overhead compartment. The bag was large, but it went inside and the compartment door closed without a problem. Shaq checked it once before sitting down because Eli's ball was in there, along with the letter he had already decided he would keep. He fastened his seatbelt, pulled the hood of his gray sweatshirt forward, and rested his head against the seat. For the first time that day, nobody was asking him for anything. He closed his eyes and thought he might finally get some sleep. A few feet away, however, a senior flight attendant had just entered the cabin and was checking the overhead compartments before departure. Her eyes moved from row to row until they stopped above seat 1A. She saw the large duffel bag, then looked down at the enormous man sitting beneath it. Within seconds, she started walking toward him. Shaq still had his eyes closed when her footsteps stopped beside his seat. Margaret Hale had worked as a flight attendant for more than a decade, long enough to believe that small rules mattered most when people wanted them ignored. She had seen passengers argue over seat assignments, luggage limits, boarding times, and safety instructions, usually with the same explanation. Their situation was different. Over the years, Margaret had learned to stay calm, speak clearly, and avoid making exceptions she could not explain later. It made her good at her job, but it also made her quick to decide what kind of problem she was looking at. When she entered the first-class cabin and saw the large duffel bag above seat 1A, she noticed its size before she noticed the man sitting beneath it. The overhead door was closed, but the bag looked larger than the dimensions allowed by company policy. To Margaret, that was enough to stop. Shaq opened his eyes when he sensed someone standing beside him. He was already exhausted from the long day with the children, and for a second he thought the attendant was going to ask whether he needed anything before takeoff. Instead, Margaret pointed toward the overhead compartment and explained that the bag would need to be checked. Shaq looked up at it, then back at her, confused because it was already safely inside and the compartment had closed without trouble. He wasn't worried about clothes or anything expensive. He was thinking about Eli's old basketball, the letters from the kids, and the promise he had made less than an hour earlier. After a short pause, he said quietly, "It's already secure. I'd really like to keep it with me if we can." Margaret heard the request, but she heard it through years of dealing with passengers who believed the rules should bend for them. She didn't know what was inside the bag, and Shaq didn't explain. From her point of view, the situation was simple. The bag appeared too large, and she had asked the passenger to check it. Shaq, on the other hand, saw a closed compartment and a bag that wasn't bothering anyone. Neither of them raised their voice, but the tension began to grow because both believed they were being reasonable. A few nearby passengers started paying attention, and Shaq immediately felt the kind of discomfort he knew too well. He had spent most of his adult life walking into rooms where people noticed his size before anything else, and he didn't want this moment to turn into a scene. He asked whether there was another way to handle it, maybe by speaking with someone else before the bag was removed. Margaret took that as resistance. She had already made her decision, and with more passengers watching, she became even less willing to change it. "I'm responsible for the cabin, sir. The bag has to come down," she told him. Shaq looked at her for a long moment and said nothing. He could have told her exactly who he was. He could have pulled back his hood and let the recognition spread through the cabin, knowing the tone of the conversation might change immediately. But he hated the idea of using his name as a weapon just to get his way. His eyes moved toward the overhead compartment again. For a moment, he pictured Eli standing in the community gym, holding that battered basketball against his chest before finally trusting Shaq enough to hand it over. The boy had already lost his father. That ball was not replaceable, no matter how much money Shaq had. He could buy another basketball, another pair of shoes, even another seat on another plane, but he could not replace the history inside that worn piece of leather. That was why the bag mattered. Margaret could not see any of that, and Shaq realized there was no simple way to explain it without turning a private promise into part of an argument. The cabin had grown quieter now. A man across the aisle glanced toward the bag, then at Margaret, while a woman behind him stopped organizing her purse and watched. Nobody had been inconvenienced by the luggage, and that made the confrontation harder for Shaq to understand. Still, Margaret had spent years believing that rules only worked when they were applied before a problem happened, not afterward. In her mind, backing down now would mean the rule had never mattered. In Shaq's mind, the rule was being applied without looking at the actual situation in front of her. Both were standing only a few feet apart, but neither could see what the other person was protecting. Margaret finally gave him a choice. She kept her voice controlled, but there was no room left in it for discussion. "If you won't check the bag, I'll have to ask you to leave the aircraft." The words settled over the cabin heavier than either of them expected. Shaq lowered his eyes for a second, not because he was afraid, but because he was deciding what kind of moment this was going to become. He could fight for the seat, fight for the bag, and probably win once people realized who he was. Or he could protect the promise he had made to Eli and walk away before the situation became uglier. Then a child a few rows back stared at him and whispered to his mother. Margaret heard only one word clearly. Shaq! The word came from somewhere behind Margaret, soft enough that most of the cabin might have missed it. She didn't. For half a second, her eyes moved toward the passengers behind Shaq, then back to the man in seat 1A. His hood was still pulled forward, his face tired, his shoulders almost too wide for the space around him. Nothing about his expression changed when the child said his name. He didn't turn around, smile, or use the moment to prove anything. He simply sat there with his hands resting on his knees, as if he had already decided that being recognized would not change what happened next. Margaret felt a small shift inside her, but she pushed it away. Famous or not, the rule was still the rule. She'd spent too many years doing this job to start changing decisions because a passenger might be important. At least, that was what she told herself. The problem was that the cabin had changed. People were no longer pretending not to watch. A man across the aisle was staring openly now, while another passenger leaned forward for a better look. The boy who had whispered Shaq's name looked confused, as if he could not understand why one of the biggest basketball stars in the world was being told to leave over a bag that was already inside the overhead bin. Shaq heard the whisper too. He knew exactly what usually happened after that first moment of recognition. One person noticed him, then another. Phones came out, voices changed. People who had been impatient suddenly became polite. Rules sometimes became softer. It was something he had seen hundreds of times, and it never sat well with him. He could have lifted his head, said his full name, and forced Margaret to realize the size of the situation she had created. Instead, he looked once more at the compartment above him and thought about the old basketball inside. For a moment, he saw Eli again. Not the gym full of kids, not the volunteers, not the event. Just one little boy standing in front of him, afraid to let go of the last basketball his father had touched. Shaq had promised that boy the ball would come back. That promise mattered more to him now than the seat, the price of the ticket, or whether anyone on the plane thought he had been treated fairly. He also knew that if he kept arguing, the scene would only get bigger. The boy behind him was already watching. Soon, everyone would be watching. So Shaq reached down and unfastened his seatbelt. The click sounded strangely loud in the quiet cabin. Margaret expected another argument, maybe a demand for a supervisor, maybe the kind of angry reaction she had seen so many times before. Instead, Shaq leaned forward and slowly stood. Because of his height, he had to bend his neck beneath the low ceiling. His shoulders nearly filled the aisle, and several passengers moved back without thinking as he reached toward the overhead compartment. He opened the door, wrapped one hand around the duffel, and lifted it down carefully. There was no dramatic gesture, no bag thrown onto the floor, no angry words. He set it beside his leg and checked the zipper almost automatically, making sure it was still closed. That small action told Margaret something she had not noticed before. Whatever was inside the bag mattered to him. He wasn't fighting over luggage space just to win an argument. She still didn't know why, but for the first time she wondered if she had misunderstood what he had been trying to protect. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. One man looked like he wanted to speak up but decided against it. The young boy behind Shaq kept watching him with the kind of disappointment children show when adults make something simple feel unfair. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder and quietly told him not to get involved. Shaq saw them as he turned toward the aisle. He gave the boy a small nod, nothing more. It was enough to make the child sit back in his seat. Margaret stepped aside to let Shaq pass. Up close, she could finally see his face clearly. There was no anger in it. That unsettled her more than anger would have. Anger was familiar. She knew how to handle shouting, threats, complaints, and passengers who promised to have someone fired. What she saw instead was disappointment held under control. It was the look of someone who had decided that leaving was easier than becoming the person everyone expected him to become. Shaq adjusted the strap of the duffel on his shoulder. Then he looked at Margaret and said the only thing he wanted her to hear. "I don't want one flight to become the worst day of anybody's life." Margaret didn't know what to say. The sentence did not sound like a threat, but somehow it carried more weight than one. Shaq wasn't warning her about his lawyers, his team, or the people he knew. He wasn't telling her she would regret what she had done. If anything, it sounded like he was trying to keep the situation from hurting her more than it already might. That made no sense to Margaret. He was the one being asked to leave. Shaq turned and started walking toward the front of the plane. The aisle suddenly seemed too narrow for him, forcing him to angle his shoulders as he moved. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. A few passengers recognized him now, and the realization moved through the cabin without anyone needing to say his name again. Some stared at Margaret. Others watched Shaq walk away. He never looked back. When he reached the aircraft door, he paused for only a second to adjust the bag. His hand rested near the zipper where Eli's ball was packed safely beneath the letters. Then, he stepped into the jet bridge and disappeared from view. The cabin remained silent after he was gone. Margaret stood in the aisle telling herself she had followed the policy. She repeated that thought once, then again, waiting for the certainty she normally felt after making a difficult decision. It did not come. Instead, she remembered the way he had checked the zipper, the way he had refused to use his name, and the strange kindness in his final words. For the first time that morning, the bag no longer felt like the problem. A passenger near the front finally leaned toward the woman beside him and whispered, "That really was Shaquille O'Neal." Margaret looked toward the empty seat 1A, and for the first time, she wondered whether following the rule and handling the situation correctly were actually the same thing. The cabin was quiet enough for Shaq to hear the air moving through the vents above him. Margaret had just told him that if he refused to check the bag, he would have to leave the aircraft. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The passengers nearby seemed to be waiting for the same thing. Anger. A man. Shaq's size. A man used to being recognized everywhere he went, had just been told to get off a plane over a bag that was already sitting safely inside the overhead compartment. It would have been easy to argue. It would have been even easier to say his name and let everyone else do the arguing for him. Instead, Shaq looked down at his hands. He thought about Eli standing in the gym a few hours earlier, holding that worn basketball like it was the most valuable thing he owned. He remembered how hard it had been for the boy to finally hand it over. That ball had belonged to Eli's father, and Shaq had promised it would come back. The easiest solution would have been to take the ball out, hand over the bag, and keep the most important item with him. But there were also letters from the children inside, along with personal things he had been trusted to carry. More than that, something in Shaq told him this argument was no longer worth winning. A few rows behind him, a boy leaned toward his mother and whispered, "Mom, that's Shaq." Margaret heard it. Her eyes moved toward the child for only a moment before returning to the man in seat 1A. The name landed differently now. She had been so focused on the bag, the policy, and the growing pressure of the cabin that she had never really looked at his face. Now, she did. The size, the voice, the familiar features suddenly connected, and a small wave of doubt ran through her. But the decision had already been made. Margaret had given him a choice in front of the cabin, and backing away now would feel like admitting that the rule changed depending on the passenger. She stayed where she was. Shaq noticed the change in her face, and he knew she had finally recognized him. Still, he didn't use it. He didn't ask if she knew who he was. He didn't wait for an apology. He simply reached for his seatbelt. The click sounded louder than it should have. Shaq slowly stood up. He had to lower his head beneath the ceiling, something he had done thousands of times in airplanes, hotel hallways, buses, and doorways built for smaller people. His shoulders filled most of the aisle as he turned toward the overhead compartment. Nobody spoke. He opened the door, reached inside, and pulled the duffel down with one hand. Then, before doing anything else, he checked the zipper. It was a small movement, almost easy to miss, but Margaret saw it. For the first time, she wondered what was actually inside the bag. Shaq rested the duffel against his leg. He could feel the basketball beneath the fabric. That simple weight reminded him why he was taking the bag with him instead of sending it below the plane. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about refusing to follow instructions. It was about keeping a promise to a child who had already learned too early that some things, once lost, never come back. Shaq had enough money to replace almost anything in that bag, but he knew he could never buy Eli another ball that had once been held by his father. A man sitting across the aisle looked at Margaret as if he wanted to say something, then stopped himself. Another passenger lowered the phone she had started to raise. The atmosphere had changed. A few minutes earlier, people had been curious about an argument. Now they were watching a man quietly give up his seat rather than turn the situation into a fight. Somehow, that made the moment harder to watch. Shaq placed the strap of the bag over his shoulder and stepped into the aisle. Margaret moved aside. When he came close, she expected at least some sign of anger. Instead, she saw exhaustion. Not just the tiredness of a long day, but the kind of tiredness that comes from having to decide again and again whether every misunderstanding deserves a battle. Shaq looked at her for a moment, and Margaret felt more uncomfortable under that calm look than she would have if he had shouted. He could have told her she was wrong. He could have promised complaints, lawyers, phone calls, or headlines. He could have made sure she understood exactly how much influence he had. But he didn't. His voice stayed low when he finally spoke. "I don't want one flight to become the worst day of anybody's life." Margaret had no answer. Shaq turned toward the front of the aircraft and began walking. Because of his size, he had to angle his shoulders slightly as he moved between the seats. The boy who had recognized him watched with wide eyes. Shaq glanced toward him and gave him a small nod. It lasted only a second, but the boy would remember it much longer than the argument. Then Shaq reached the aircraft door. He adjusted the bag on his shoulder, felt the weight of Eli's basketball inside, and walked into the jet bridge without looking back. There was no final complaint, no demand for a manager, no angry gesture for the passengers watching him leave. The door remained open behind him for a few seconds, showing only the empty passage leading back toward the terminal. Inside the cabin, nobody knew what to say. Margaret stood beside the now empty seat 1A. She told herself she had followed the policy. The bag appeared too large. She had made a decision. The passenger had refused to check it. On paper, the sequence still made sense. But the certainty she usually felt after handling a difficult situation was gone. She kept thinking about the way Shaq had checked the zipper before he walked away. She kept hearing his last sentence. Most of all, she kept remembering that he had realized she knew who he was and had still chosen not to use it against her. A passenger near the front finally broke the silence. "That really was Shaquille O'Neal." Margaret looked at the empty seat again. For the first time, she wasn't wondering whether she'd followed the rule. She was wondering what would happen when the rest of the airline found out who she had just sent off the plane. The young gate agent looked up when the jet bridge door opened and saw Shaq walking toward him with the duffel bag over one shoulder. For a second, he forgot he was at work. He had grown up watching Lakers games with his father, sitting on the living room floor while Shaq dominated the paint and made every basket look too small for him. His father had loved those games, especially the ones that ran late when they were supposed to be asleep. Now the same man was standing a few feet away, looking tired and carrying his own bag after being removed from a flight. The agent quickly realized this was not a normal customer service problem. Shaq didn't complain. He didn't demand special treatment. He simply explained that he needed another flight to Los Angeles and wanted to keep the bag with him. That calmness made the situation feel even more serious. Within minutes, the agent called his supervisor, who called another manager, and soon the news moved through the airport faster than Shaq wanted it to. People began appearing at the gate with the careful expressions of employees who had just learned that a simple baggage dispute involved one of the most famous athletes in America. A seat on another flight was offered almost immediately. Then came an offer for a hotel room if he wanted to wait until the next morning. Someone suggested a private car to another airport where there might be a better connection. Another manager offered to personally handle his luggage. Shaq declined nearly all of it. He didn't want a scene, and he didn't want the airline trying to fix his embarrassment with luxury. He wanted a seat, his bag beside him, and enough quiet to think. As he waited, he sat down in one of the hard airport chairs and placed the duffel between his feet. His hand rested on the top of it for a moment. Somewhere inside was Eli's basketball. The thought brought him back to the gym, to the way the boy had hesitated before letting go of something that belonged to his father. That memory helped keep the anger from rising. Shaq knew the situation had been unfair, but he also knew anger had a way of making every decision afterward feel justified. About 20 minutes later, a regional airline executive arrived at the gate. His suit was slightly wrinkled from moving too quickly through the terminal, and he already had an apology prepared. He introduced himself, sat down across from Shaq, and began explaining that the airline took the matter very seriously. Shaq listened for only a few seconds before stopping him. "Before we talk about me, tell me what happens to her." The executive was caught off guard. He had expected anger, compensation demands, maybe a request for disciplinary action. Instead, Shaq was asking about the flight attendant. The man explained that there would likely be an internal review and that Margaret's decision would be examined against company policy. He tried to keep the answer professional, but Shaq noticed what he wasn't saying. A public incident involving a celebrity could become much bigger than the original mistake. Shaq looked down at the bag and thought about how quickly a person's life could change because of one moment. Margaret had embarrassed him, and he was still bothered by the way she handled it. But she had not insulted him, cursed at him, or treated him with open cruelty. She had believed she was enforcing a rule. Maybe she had been too rigid. Maybe she had made a bad call. But Shaq knew something about public judgment. Once a story became bigger than the people inside it, nobody cared much about the difference between a bad decision and a bad person. The executive began explaining what the airline could do for Shaq personally. Shaq shook his head. The upgrade, hotel, transportation, and compensation no longer mattered to him. He had another flight coming, and he could afford to solve almost any travel problem on his own. Margaret could not control what happened once management, lawyers, and the public became involved. For the first time since leaving the plane, Shaq felt more concerned about that than about what had happened to him. He looked directly at the executive. "I don't want my fame becoming a hammer that falls on someone who is just trying to do her job." The man didn't answer right away. In years of handling complaints, he had rarely seen the person with the most power in the situation worry first about the person who had caused the problem. Shaq wasn't asking them to pretend nothing happened. He wasn't saying Margaret had handled everything correctly. He was asking them not to let his name turn a mistake into a career-ending punishment. The executive finally promised that the review would be fair. Shaq nodded, but he did not look fully satisfied. He had seen enough of the world to know that fair could mean different things once public pressure started building. What bothered him most was the thought that Margaret might already be sitting on that plane, unaware that people were calling managers. Reporters might soon be asking questions, and strangers could be deciding what kind of person she was before she even reached Los Angeles. The gate agent watched the conversation from a distance. He had spent years thinking Shaq was powerful because of what he could do on a basketball court. Watching him now, he began to understand a different kind of power. Shaq had every advantage in this moment. Money, fame, influence, and public sympathy were all on his side. Yet the first person he tried to protect was the woman who had asked him to leave. A boarding announcement came over the speakers for Shaq's new flight. He stood, lifted the duffel onto his shoulder, and thanked the gate agent. Before walking away, he looked back at the executive and made one final request. "Just don't destroy her over this." Then Shaq headed toward his new gate. But as he walked away, one thought stayed with him. Protecting Margaret from the airline might be possible. Protecting her from what would happen once the story reached the public was something else entirely. Shaq sat alone near the new gate with the duffel bag between his feet. The airport kept moving around him like nothing had happened. Families rushed past with carry-ons, business travelers stared at their phones, and a gate agent called boarding groups over the speakers. A few people recognized him, but most simply looked twice and kept walking. For once, Shaq was glad nobody came over. He was still angry, but not in the way people might have expected. He wasn't thinking about the price of the ticket or the embarrassment of being asked to leave. He was thinking about how quickly one bad moment could turn into something much bigger. He took out his phone and called his mother, Lucille O'Neal. She had known him before the NBA, before the money, and before strangers began changing the way they spoke the moment they realized who he was. Shaq told her what had happened, keeping it simple. He explained the bag, the flight attendant, the argument, and why he had chosen to walk off instead of letting the situation grow. He admitted that part of him still felt disrespected. Lucille listened all the way through without trying to comfort him too quickly, which was one of the reasons he had called her in the first place. When he finished, she asked him one question. "Do you really think that woman woke up this morning planning to hurt you?" Shaq looked down at the floor for a few seconds. He replayed Margaret's face in his mind, the way she had stood firm even after she realized who he was. She had been stubborn. She had made him feel like a problem instead of a passenger. But she had not looked cruel. Finally, he said no. That answer forced him to see the moment differently. Lucille reminded him that people were often more complicated than the worst few minutes you happen to witness. Someone could be tired, stressed, scared of making a mistake, or simply too used to protecting themselves with rules. None of that meant the person was right. It also did not mean one bad decision should become their entire identity. Before ending the call, Lucille gave him one thought to carry with him. Don't let somebody else's 5 bad minutes decide who you become in your next 5. Shaq stayed in the chair after the call ended. His anger was still there, but it no longer felt as clean and simple as it had before. He could believe Margaret had handled the situation badly without believing she deserved to have her life destroyed over it. He knew too well what public judgment could do. Athletes were reduced to one missed shot, one bad interview, one mistake caught on camera. People forgot years of good work because anger needed a simple villain. Shaq had been on the receiving end of that kind of judgment more than once, and he did not want to hand it to someone else just because he now had the advantage. He reached down and opened the duffel bag. Eli's white envelope was tucked beside the worn basketball, exactly where Shaq had placed it earlier. He pulled it out and read the letter again. The handwriting was uneven, and some of the words had been erased so hard that the paper had almost torn. Eli wrote about missing his father, about how quiet the house sometimes felt, and about how much it meant when adults kept promises. Then Shaq reached the line that had stayed with him since leaving the community center. When I grow up, I want to be strong like you. My mom says I need a big heart before I need big muscles. Shaq read it twice. Earlier, the line had made him smile. Now it made him uncomfortable in a different way. Eli had trusted him with something that could never be replaced, and he had also trusted him with an idea of what strength looked like. Shaq suddenly wondered what the boy would think if he knew what had happened on the plane. Would he think strength meant fighting until someone admitted you were right? Would he think it meant having enough influence to make the other person pay? Or would he remember the lesson his mother had tried to teach him? Shaq folded the letter slowly and held it in his hand. He realized that walking away from the plane had kept him from making the situation worse, but maybe that was not enough. Margaret was probably still in the air, finishing her shift without knowing that managers were already talking about the incident. Once she landed, she might face questions, criticism, and consequences she had not expected. Shaq knew he could not control what the public would say, but he could control what she heard from him. He looked toward the gate counter. The young employee who had recognized him earlier was sorting boarding documents, occasionally glancing in Shaq's direction. Shaq thought about calling his agent or asking someone on his staff to handle it, but that felt too distant. If he wanted Margaret to understand that he did not hate her, then the message needed to come from him, not from a lawyer or a publicist. For a few moments, he stayed seated with Eli's letter in one hand and the other resting on the duffel bag. The old basketball inside reminded him of a promise. His mother's words reminded him of a choice. And somewhere between those two things, Shaq decided what he wanted to do next. He stood, walked toward the counter, and looked at the young gate agent. "Can you get me a piece of paper?" The gate agent brought Shaq a blank sheet of printer paper and a pen. There was no airline logo at the top, no official letterhead, and no room for anyone else to speak for him. That was exactly what Shaq wanted. He could have called his lawyer. He could have had his publicist prepare a statement that sounded careful and professional. He could have let the airline's executives handle everything from that point forward. Instead, he sat back down in the same airport chair, placed the paper on his knee, and stared at it for a long moment. Writing the first sentence turned out to be harder than he expected. Shaq was used to talking in front of cameras, answering reporters, and speaking to crowds. This was different. He wasn't trying to defend himself or explain why Margaret had been wrong. He was trying to reach a woman who might already be frightened about what would happen when the plane landed. Every sentence had to do one thing: make sure she knew he did not want revenge. He started by writing that he didn't believe she had come to work that morning looking for someone to hurt. He told her that Maybe they had simply met at the wrong moment, when both of them were tired and neither one understood what the other person was carrying. Margaret had seen a bag that broke a rule. Shaq had seen a bag filled with things he had promised to protect. Neither of them had explained enough. By the time they understood that the argument meant something different to each of them, the moment had already gone too far. Shaq stopped writing and looked toward the runway. He remembered how easy it would have been to embarrass her in front of the cabin. All he had needed to do was pull back his hood, say his name, and let the passengers turn against her. He had seen enough public arguments to know how quickly a crowd could choose a side. But sitting there now, he felt less interested in proving who had been right. He kept thinking about what his mother had said and about Eli's letter sitting inside the duffel beside him. He returned to the page and wrote the part that mattered most. "I don't believe you came to work today hoping to hurt somebody. Maybe we just met at a moment when we were both too tired to understand what the other person was carrying." Shaq read the sentence back to himself. It did not erase what happened, and he didn't want it to. Margaret had made a decision that left him feeling embarrassed and misunderstood. He could admit that without turning her into a villain. The difference mattered to him more now than it had an hour earlier. He continued writing. He told Margaret that she might be questioned by supervisors when she landed and that people might say things about her without knowing the full story. He could not control that. What he could control was whether she believed he was one of the people waiting to punish her. He made it clear that he was not asking the airline to ignore the incident, only to treat her fairly. One mistake, he wrote, should not be allowed to become the only thing people remembered about years of work. Then Shaq paused again. For the first time since leaving the aircraft, he tried to imagine the situation from Margaret's side. She would finish the flight, step off the plane, and probably be met by managers who already knew the passenger she had removed was Shaquille O'Neal. Maybe she would see her name online. Maybe she would call her daughter before speaking to anyone else. Maybe she would spend the night wondering if one decision had just ended the career she had built over more than a decade. Shaq knew that fear would not make her decision right, but it made her human. That was when he wrote the final part. "If what happened today keeps you awake tonight, please don't let one difficult moment convince you that you're a bad person." He stopped there. There were other things he could have added. He could have explained Eli's basketball. He could have told her exactly why he refused to let the bag out of his sight. He could have written that she should have listened longer before making her decision. But none of those things felt necessary anymore. The letter was not meant to win the argument after the fact. It was meant to reach her before fear, shame, and public opinion did. Shaq signed his name at the bottom and read the page one final time. Then he folded it carefully down the middle. The gate agent had been trying not to watch from behind the counter, but when Shaq stood and walked toward him, the young man straightened immediately. He expected another request about the replacement flight. Instead, Shaq handed him the folded sheet. The employee looked down at it, then back at Shaq. Shaq explained that the letter was for Margaret and that he wanted it delivered personally. He did not want it passed through lawyers, management, or anyone in public relations. More importantly, he wanted her to receive it before anyone sat her down to explain what consequences might be coming. Then he said quietly, "Make sure she gets this before management decides what to do with her." The gate agent nodded and took the letter with both hands. A few minutes later, Shaq boarded his new flight with the duffel still over his shoulder. Eli's basketball was safe inside. His mother's words were still in his head. And behind him, in the pocket of a young airport employee, was a plain folded page that carried no logo, no demand, and no threat. Margaret had no idea it existed. By the time she landed, however, that letter would be waiting for her before the rest of the airline was ready to decide who she had become. Margaret knew something was wrong before the plane had even reached the gate. The passengers had been quieter with her after Shaq left, and several of them avoided eye contact as they gathered their bags. A few whispered to each other near the front of the cabin, glancing in her direction whenever they thought she wasn't looking. She tried to stay focused on her work, checking the cabin and thanking people as they stepped off the plane. It was what she always did after a difficult flight. Finish the job first, think about everything else later. When the last few passengers were gone, another flight attendant came toward her with a look Margaret immediately noticed. There was no anger in it, only concern. The woman asked if Margaret knew who had been sitting in seat 1A. Margaret already suspected the answer, but hearing the name out loud made the situation suddenly real. Shaquille O'Neal was not simply a tall passenger some people recognized. He was one of the most famous basketball players in the country, someone whose name alone could turn a disagreement on an airplane into a national story. Margaret looked toward the empty seat. The overhead compartment was still closed above it, exactly as it had been before the argument began. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what had happened. She had not known who Shaq was when she approached him, and part of her still believed that should not matter. A rule should not change because someone was famous. But another part of her kept returning to the way he had left. He had not threatened her, demanded her name, or told the cabin that she would regret what she had done. His calmness now felt more frightening than anger would have. By the time Margaret reached the employee area, her phone was already full of missed calls. One was from her supervisor, another was from a number she didn't recognize. Several were from her daughter, Rachel. Margaret stared at the screen for a few seconds before calling her back. Rachel answered almost immediately, sounding more frightened than Margaret had ever heard her. "Mom, your name is everywhere." Margaret sat down on a bench and opened her phone. At first, she didn't understand what she was seeing. Someone from the flight had posted about the incident, and the story was spreading much faster than she could follow it. People were arguing about what had happened, even though most of them had not been there. Some called her heartless. Others said she had humiliated Shaq on purpose. A few demanded that the airline fire her immediately. What frightened Margaret most were the strangers trying to find more about her, where she worked, what city she lived in, whether she had family. She had dealt with angry passengers for years. She had been yelled at, cursed at, blamed for delays she could not control, and once had a drink thrown near her during a weather cancellation. None of those moments had followed her home. This one had. She suddenly understood that the argument had not ended when Shaq walked off the plane. It had simply moved somewhere much larger, into a place where thousands of people could judge her without ever hearing her voice. Rachel asked what had really happened. Margaret explained as much as she could, still trying to make sense of it herself. She told her daughter that the bag appeared too large and that she had followed what she believed was the right procedure. But even as she said it, the explanation sounded weaker than it had inside the cabin. She remembered the compartment closing. She remembered Shaq asking for another option. Most of all, she remembered the way he had looked at her before leaving. Not angry, just tired. Rachel stayed quiet for a moment before asking the question Margaret had been trying not to think about. "Mom, are you going to lose your job?" That was when Margaret finally broke. Not when strangers called her cruel. Not when someone online said she deserved to be fired. Not even when she saw her own name being shared by people she had never met. It was hearing fear in her daughter's voice that got through the wall she had built around herself. Margaret had spent years believing that if she worked hard, followed procedure, and kept her emotions under control, she could keep her life stable. Now, one decision made in a few tense minutes seemed capable of taking all of that away. She wiped her face quickly, even though no one was sitting close enough to see. "I don't know," she said. It was the first honest answer she had given herself all evening. That night, Margaret barely slept. She kept her phone face down on the kitchen table, but she still found herself reaching for it every few minutes. Each time she looked, there were more messages and more opinions. She stopped reading after midnight. The words were beginning to blur together, and she realized that defending herself to strangers would change nothing. What stayed with her instead was Shaq's final sentence on the plane. He had said he didn't want one flight to become the worst day of anybody's life. At the time, she had thought he was talking about himself. Sitting alone in her kitchen, Margaret began to wonder if he'd been thinking about her too. Early the next morning, the airline called and instructed her to report to Human Resources before her next assignment. No one told her whether she was being suspended or fired. Margaret dressed slowly, put on the uniform she had worn hundreds of times, and looked at herself in the mirror longer than usual. For the first time in more than a decade, the uniform no longer made her feel secure. When she arrived at the airport, she walked toward the Human Resources office with a tight feeling in her chest. She expected a manager, maybe a lawyer, maybe someone carrying paperwork she would have to sign. Instead, a young gate employee was standing outside the office waiting for her. He held a plain, white envelope in his hand. Margaret slowed down. Her first name was written across the front. The young man stepped toward her and said the envelope had come from Shaquille O'Neal. Margaret stopped a few steps from the Human Resources office and stared at the envelope in the young gate employee's hand. For most of the night, she had imagined what would be waiting for her at the airport. A suspension notice, a written warning, maybe paperwork telling her to turn in her badge. She had even practiced what she would say if someone asked her to explain the incident again. But she had never imagined that the first thing waiting for her would come from Shaquille O'Neal himself. The envelope was plain, slightly bent at one corner, with her first name written across the front in large handwriting. There was no lawyer's name, no airline logo, and no official language printed anywhere on it. The employee held it out carefully. "Mr. O'Neal wanted you to read this before any official meeting." Margaret looked at him, unsure whether to take it. For one uncomfortable second, she wondered if the letter was going to make everything worse. Maybe Shaq had written down exactly how angry he was. Maybe he wanted an apology. Maybe this was the first step toward a complaint that would follow her for the rest of her career. The young man seemed to understand what she was thinking because he quietly added that Shaq had written it himself at the gate almost immediately after leaving the plane. That detail made Margaret finally reach for the envelope. She did not open it in the hallway. Instead, she asked for a few minutes and walked to a small employee break room nearby. It was still early, and the room was empty except for a coffee machine humming against the wall and two chairs pushed beneath a scratched table. Margaret sat down but kept the envelope in her hands. She had faced angry passengers without shaking, handled medical emergencies at 30,000 feet, and stayed calm during severe turbulence while other people screamed. Yet now her fingers felt stiff around a single sheet of paper. She took one slow breath, opened the envelope, and unfolded the letter. The first thing that surprised her was what the letter did not contain. There was no accusation. Shaq did not tell her she had embarrassed him or list all the ways she had been wrong. He did not mention lawyers, compensation, or the attention the incident was already getting. Instead, he wrote that he did not believe she had started her day intending to hurt anyone. He said he believed they had met at a bad moment, when both of them were tired and neither understood what the other person was carrying. Margaret stopped there and looked toward the door as if someone might walk in and tell her she had misunderstood what she was reading. She continued. Shaq wrote that he still believed the situation could have been handled differently, but he did not want one difficult decision to become the only thing people remembered about her. He told her he had already asked the airline to be fair and not to let his fame make the punishment bigger than the mistake. Then Margaret reached the sentence that made her stop breathing for a moment. One mistake should never be allowed to swallow an entire human life. Her hands began to tremble. She read that sentence again. Then she went back to the beginning and read the entire letter a second time, more slowly. The night before, thousands of strangers had reduced her to a few minutes inside an airplane. They had called her cruel, arrogant, hateful, and worse. People who had never met her had decided they knew what kind of woman she was. Margaret had spent hours telling herself she didn't care what strangers thought, but the truth was that every word had found a place to hurt. Now the man with the strongest reason to be angry was the first person who had separated what she had done from who she was. That was what finally broke through her. Margaret placed the letter on the table and covered her face with both hands. At first, she tried to stop herself. Crying at work had always felt like something she could control if she simply stayed busy enough. She had raised a daughter through difficult years, worked long shifts when money was tight, and learned to keep going even when she was exhausted. She had built a life around being dependable because dependable people did not fall apart when things became uncomfortable. But there was no passenger waiting for her now, no safety check to complete, and no reason to pretend she was fine. The tears came quietly. She cried because she was afraid of losing her job. She cried because her daughter had sounded scared on the phone. She cried because part of her still believed she had been doing what she was trained to do, while another part now understood that she had stopped listening too soon. Most of all, she cried because Shaq had been given the easiest opportunity in the world to punish her and had chosen not to use it. He did not excuse her decision. He simply refused to let that decision become her entire identity. After several minutes, Margaret picked up the letter again. Near the bottom, Shaq had written one final thought. If this keeps you awake tonight, don't let one hard moment convince you that you're a bad person. Margaret pressed her lips together and looked down at the page. She had barely slept. She had spent the whole night afraid that one moment had revealed something terrible about her. Somehow, sitting in an airport miles away, the man she had removed from the plane had understood exactly what she would be afraid of before she understood it herself. Margaret folded the letter carefully along the same crease and placed it back inside the envelope. She did not suddenly believe she had done nothing wrong. In some ways, that would have been easier. Instead, she was beginning to see that being technically justified and handling another human being well were not always the same thing. That realization hurt, but it also gave her something the angry comments online never could: a reason to change without first having to hate herself. There was a soft knock on the door. The young gate employee told her Human Resources was ready to see her. Margaret wiped her face, stood up, and placed the envelope inside the inner pocket of her uniform jacket. She could feel the paper resting against her chest as she walked toward the office. She still didn't know whether she would be suspended, disciplined, or sent home. But something inside her had shifted before the meeting even began. Shaq's letter had reached her before the punishment did. And when Margaret opened the Human Resources door, she was about to discover just how far he had gone to make sure one mistake did not become the end of her story. Shaq returned to Los Angeles and was back at practice before the story had fully settled in his mind. The gym felt familiar in a way the airport had not. Sneakers squeaked across the floor. Basketballs hit the hardwood, and coaches moved from one drill to the next without caring what had happened to him the day before. Usually, that kind of routine helped Shaq leave everything else outside, but this time, he was quieter than normal. He still practiced hard, still joked when someone missed badly, still did what he was supposed to do, but there were longer stretches when he simply stood near the baseline and seemed somewhere else. Phil Jackson noticed almost immediately. He had coached long enough to recognize the difference between a player who was tired and one who was carrying something he had not worked through yet. Shaq's body was in practice, but his attention kept slipping away. Between drills, Phil watched him sit alone for a moment, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He did not ask about it right away. Phil knew that some questions worked better when a person had enough silence around them to hear the answer. Kobe noticed too, although he approached it differently. During a break, he came over and asked Shaq what had really happened at the airport. By then, parts of the story were already moving through sports circles, and the version people were repeating made it sound simple. Famous NBA star gets removed from a flight. Airline makes a mistake. Someone should pay. Kobe listened as Shaq explained that he had already asked the airline not to destroy Margaret's career over the incident. He seemed surprised that Shaq had gone out of his way to protect someone who had embarrassed him in front of a cabin full of people. Shaq understood why. In professional sports, you were taught to compete, respond, and never let someone take advantage of you. Respect mattered, and when someone crossed a line, there was always pressure to prove that you would not accept it. Shaq had lived inside that mindset for years, but the moment at the gate had felt different. Margaret was not an opponent trying to beat him. She was a working woman who had made a decision he believed was wrong. If he used everything he had, money, fame, lawyers, public attention to crush her, he might win the argument and still feel worse afterward. He finally told Kobe, "If winning means an ordinary person loses everything, I'm not sure that's a win." Kobe did not answer right away. The comment hung between them longer than Shaq expected. Then practice resumed, and the conversation ended there. But Shaq kept thinking about what he had said. He knew part of him still wanted someone to admit that Margaret had been wrong. He still remembered the embarrassment of standing up while everyone watched, taking his bag down and walking off a plane he had paid to be on. Choosing not to punish her had not erased that feeling. After practice, Phil found Shaq near the tunnel leading away from the court. Most of the team had already moved toward the locker room. Phil did not ask about airline policy or whether Shaq planned to make a public statement. Instead, he asked what Shaq had felt when Margaret looked at him before she knew who he was. That question stopped him. Shaq thought about it for a moment. The bag had started the argument, but the bag was not what stayed with him. What stayed with him was the feeling of being reduced to the biggest thing in the room again. Before Margaret knew his name, she had seen a huge man, a huge bag, and a possible problem. Shaq had known that feeling since childhood. Adults often assumed he was older because he was taller. Other kids expected him to be tougher because he was bigger. When something went wrong, people sometimes looked at him first, simply because he was impossible not to notice. Phil let the silence stretch, then asked quietly, "Are you angry because of what she did? Or are you hurt because of the way she saw you?" Shaq had an answer ready for the first question. He had none for the second. The truth was uncomfortable. He had spent years pretending those moments no longer bothered him. Fame made some of them easier because people recognized him before they could make assumptions. But that came with its own problem. Once people knew who he was, they often stopped treating him normally in the opposite direction. Suddenly, rules changed, doors opened, voices softened, and mistakes disappeared. At the airport, Shaq had experienced both versions within minutes. First, he had been treated like a difficult, oversized passenger. Then, after people recognized him, executives were ready to give him almost anything. Neither version felt like being seen clearly. That night, Shaq went home tired but could not sleep. The house was quiet, and he found himself thinking about moments he had not remembered in years. He remembered being a kid and watching adults speak to him like he was much older than he really was. He remembered being blamed during schoolyard arguments because everyone assumed the biggest kid must have started them. He remembered learning early that if he raised his voice, even when he was scared, people saw danger instead of fear. Then he thought about Margaret. For the first time, Shaq understood why her decision had bothered him so deeply. It was not only that she had asked him to leave the plane. It was that for a few minutes, before she knew his name, he had felt invisible inside the largest body in the room. He got out of bed and walked into the kitchen for water. His duffel bag was still sitting near the doorway where he had left it. Eli's basketball was inside, waiting to be signed and sent home. Shaq rested his hand on the bag and remembered the boy's letter about becoming strong without making other people feel small. That sentence felt different now. Shaq had spent most of his life learning how to live with being seen before being known. What he had not yet decided was what he wanted to do with that lesson. The next morning, Shaq was still thinking about Phil Jackson's question. He had spent years believing he was used to being judged before people knew him, but the flight had opened something he thought he had already learned to ignore. Before Margaret knew his name, she had seen his size, his bag, and a problem she needed to control. After she learned who he was, everything changed. Managers appeared, apologies came quickly, and people suddenly wanted to make things easier for him. Shaq had experienced both versions before, but this time the difference bothered him more than usual. He wanted to understand why, so he called the man who had first taught him what to do when the world reacted to his size before it reacted to his character. Philip Harrison had been part of Shaq's life long before packed arenas and NBA championships. He had raised him with military discipline, clear expectations, and very little patience for excuses. Growing up, Shaq had not always appreciated that. Philip could be demanding, especially when Shaq was young and still learning how much attention his body attracted everywhere he went. But as Shaq got older, he understood that his stepfather had been preparing him for something larger than basketball. He had been teaching a boy who would one day walk into almost any room and immediately become the biggest person in it. Shaq told him about the flight. He explained that Margaret had focused on the bag, refused to change her decision, and eventually told him to leave. He also told Philip what happened afterward, the executives, the apologies, the offers, and his decision to ask the airline not to destroy Margaret's career. Philip listened without rushing to tell Shaq whether he had been right or wrong. That was not what Shaq needed anyway. He already knew what happened. What he was trying to understand was why it had stayed with him. Philip reminded him of something from childhood. When Shaq was still a boy, he was already much bigger than most kids his age. If two children pushed each other on a playground and Shaq was involved, adults often looked at him first. If another kid started a fight and Shaq defended himself, people sometimes assumed the bigger child must have been the aggressor. His size made him noticeable, but it also made him responsible in ways other children were not. There had been days when young Shaquille came home angry because he felt punished simply for being larger. Philip had never told him that the situation was fair. Instead, he taught him that fairness would not always arrive before his next decision. Shaq could not control what strangers assumed when they looked at him. He could control what he did after they made that assumption. Philip reminded him that even as a boy, Shaq had enough strength to scare people without meaning to. That meant losing control would always cost him more than it cost someone smaller. Shaq remembered one particular afternoon from his childhood. Another boy had mocked him until Shaq finally shoved him. The other kid barely moved, but a teacher saw only the moment Shaq's hands touched him. Shaq came home furious and expected Philip to defend him completely. Instead, Philip listened to the whole story and then asked why Shaq had given the other boy control over his actions. At the time, Shaq hated the question. Years later, he understood it. Philip told him that having power did not mean pretending people could not hurt him. It meant understanding how much damage he could cause when he acted from that hurt. That lesson had become even more important once Shaq became famous. Now his strength was not only physical, a complaint from him could reach executives. One angry interview could become a headline. One sentence could turn thousands of strangers against a person they had never met. The man who once had to be careful with his hands now also had to be careful with his name. Then Philip gave him the thought Shaq had been looking for. Strength isn't about how many people you can scare. It's about knowing you could and choosing not to. Shaq stayed quiet. The words were simple, but they connected almost every part of the last few days. He thought about Margaret standing in the aisle before she knew who he was. He thought about the executives who became nervous the moment they did. He thought about the letter he had written instead of a complaint. Most of all, he thought about Eli, a 9-year-old boy who had written that he wanted to grow up strong without making other people feel small. For the first time, Shaq saw that the incident could become more than a story about one flight attendant and one passenger. Margaret had made a mistake, but she was not the only person working a job where one difficult moment could suddenly become public. Airline employees, hotel workers, security guards, restaurant staff, drivers, ordinary people spent every day enforcing rules for strangers. Most of the time, nobody noticed them. But if the wrong situation involved someone famous, one bad decision could follow them long after the shift ended. That idea stayed with Shaq after the call. Later that evening, he opened the duffel bag and took out Eli's basketball. He signed it carefully, adding a short message beneath his name before placing it back inside the bag. Then he noticed Margaret's situation had left him thinking about something bigger. Asking the airline not to fire her might protect one woman. It would not change what happened the next time another employee faced a difficult passenger or the next time a minor mistake became a public storm before anyone had time to understand what really happened. Shaq sat at his kitchen table for a while with a phone in front of him. He could have let the whole thing end there. The airline was reviewing the incident. Margaret had received his letter. His own flight was over. Most people would have called that enough, but Philip's words would not leave him alone. Shaq picked up the phone and called the airline again. The executive who answered expected another question about Margaret. Shaq surprised him. "I think we're trying to fix the wrong problem." There was a pause on the other end. Shaq leaned back in his chair and began explaining an idea that had nothing to do with compensation, punishment, or an apology. This time, he wanted to talk about what could happen before the next situation ever reached that point. When the airline executive answered Shaq's call, he expected to hear another question about Margaret. Instead, Shaq told him that protecting one employee would not solve the real problem. What happened on that flight could happen again with a different passenger, a different worker, and a different rule. The people working closest to customers were often asked to make quick decisions under pressure, then judged afterward by people who had not been standing there. Shaq did not want the airline to pretend Margaret had done nothing wrong. He wanted them to ask why the situation had reached the point where one person felt forced to leave and the other felt forced to make him. The executive listened as Shaq explained that he was not interested in a lawsuit, a settlement, or a public apology. He did not want his name on a training program, and he did not want cameras showing him shaking hands with airline leaders. If they were going to change something, he wanted it to help employees when nobody was watching. Shaq suggested better conflict resolution training for flight attendants, gate agents, and other frontline workers who dealt with tired, frustrated, scared, or angry passengers every day. The goal would not be to make employees weak or afraid to enforce policy. It would be to help them recognize when a situation needed more than a rule book. Shaq knew how easy it was to say that from the outside. He had never worked a full shift on an airplane, never spent hours handling strangers who blamed him for delays, missed connections, or rules he did not create. That was exactly why he did not want the training built around his experience alone. He asked the airline to include employees who had been yelled at, threatened, embarrassed, and pushed into difficult decisions. They needed to talk about what made people shut down, what made conversations turn into confrontations, and what could be done before either side felt trapped. Then Shaq gave them the one idea he cared about most. Don't teach people how to win arguments. Teach them how to notice when the person in front of them might be having one of the hardest days of their life. The executive wrote the sentence down. Shaq explained that the same idea had to work in both directions. Sometimes the passenger was scared. Sometimes the employee was exhausted. Sometimes both people were carrying something the other could not see. A father traveling to a funeral might sound rude because he had not slept. A flight attendant working her third difficult trip of the week might sound cold because she had spent all day being blamed for things outside her control. Understanding that did not mean ignoring safety or accepting abuse. It meant taking a few extra seconds before deciding the person in front of you was simply difficult. The more they talked, the more the executive realized Shaq was serious. He was not trying to build a public image out of what happened. In fact, he asked that his name stay out of the project completely. He offered to help cover the cost of developing the program and suggested setting aside money for employees who found themselves caught in public controversies. Shaq had seen how quickly Margaret's life had become a subject for strangers to discuss. He knew there would be other workers who might face something similar without having anyone powerful enough to ask that they be treated fairly. The support fund was small at first. It was meant for people who could suddenly face unpaid leave, legal expenses, counseling costs, or family stress after a workplace incident became public. Shaq did not want it used to protect people who had clearly acted with cruelty or bad intentions. He wanted it for workers who had made a good faith decision, even if that decision later proved to be wrong. The difference mattered to him. A person could need correction without needing to be destroyed. At the airline, the idea created some uncomfortable conversations. Some managers worried that new training would make employees hesitate when safety rules needed to be enforced. Others worried that creating a support fund might look like admitting the company had failed Margaret. Shaq refused to get pulled into those arguments. He kept bringing the conversation back to the same point. The next difficult situation was going to happen whether they prepared for it or not. The question was whether employees would have better tools when it did. Within weeks, the airline began building a pilot training course. It included real passenger conflicts, role-playing, de-escalation methods, and something that had been missing from many older programs. A moment where employees were asked to stop and consider what information they did not know. Not every problem could be solved with patience. Not every passenger deserved another chance. But sometimes 10 extra seconds of listening could prevent 10 minutes of confrontation. Margaret heard about the program during a meeting with her supervisor. By then, the noise around the incident had started to fade, but the letter from Shaq was still inside her work bag. She had read it enough times that she no longer needed to unfold it to remember certain lines. When her supervisor explained that the airline was looking for employees willing to join the first training group, Margaret understood immediately where the idea had come from. For a few seconds, she felt embarrassed. Part of her wondered whether signing up would look like an admission that she had failed at a job she had done for more than a decade. Then she thought about the empty break room, the white envelope, and the sentence that had made her hands shake. Shaq had not protected her so she could pretend nothing happened. He had protected her long enough to decide what she wanted to learn from it. Margaret looked at the sign-up sheet. There were still blank spaces under the first session. She picked up the pen and wrote her name at the top. When her supervisor saw it, she seemed surprised. Margaret only said, "I think I need to understand what I missed." A few days later, the airline sent Shaq a short update. The training program was moving forward. Funding had been accepted quietly. No press release would mention his involvement. At the bottom of the message was one more detail. The first employee who had volunteered to attend was Margaret Hale. Margaret did not walk into the training room expecting it to change her. At first, she treated the sessions the way she treated every required course the airline assigned. Arrive early, take notes, complete the exercises, move on. But this program felt different because it kept returning to moments she knew too well. An angry passenger, a frightened child, a tired employee, a rule that had to be enforced when emotions were already high. During the first session, the instructor asked everyone to think about the few seconds before a conflict became something bigger. Margaret looked down at her notebook and wrote 2 words at the top of the page. 1 minute. That phrase stayed with her. 1 minute before deciding someone was difficult. 1 minute before raising her voice. 1 minute to ask one more question or notice something she had missed. Margaret had spent years believing that quick decisions made her good at her job, and many times they had. But she was beginning to see that speed and judgment were not always the same thing. She still believed in rules. She still believed passengers had responsibilities. The difference was that she was trying to understand the person standing in front of her before deciding what the situation meant. Several months later, Margaret was working a crowded afternoon flight when she heard a child crying near the middle of the cabin. At first, it sounded like the normal fear some young passengers felt during boarding. Then the crying grew louder. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, stood frozen in the aisle beside her father, refusing to move toward their seats. Passengers were beginning to pile up behind them, and the father was trying to pull the girl forward while apologizing to everyone around him. The more he tried to move her, the more frightened she became. Margaret moved quickly toward them. Her first instinct was familiar. The aisle had to be cleared. Boarding could not continue like this. People needed to sit down so the aircraft could leave on time. She opened her mouth, ready to use the firm voice that had worked for years. Then she saw the girl's hands. They were shaking. The child was not being stubborn. She was terrified. Margaret stopped. For a few seconds, the pressure of the whole cabin seemed to disappear. She remembered the training. She remembered the words she had written in her notebook. Most of all, she remembered a large man sitting in seat 1A while she had decided what kind of problem he was before she understood what he was protecting. Margaret lowered herself until she was almost at the girl's eye level. The father started explaining that his daughter had never flown before and had been nervous since they entered the airport. Margaret gave him a small nod but kept her attention on the child. She did not tell her to calm down. She did not promise there was nothing to be afraid of. She simply held out her hand. "You don't have to stop being scared right now. Just take one breath with me." The little girl stared at her. Margaret breathed in slowly, then out. The girl tried to copy her, but the first breath came out broken. Margaret waited and did it again. This time the child followed more closely. On the third breath, her shoulders dropped a little. The father stopped pulling her forward and knelt beside her. People were still waiting in the aisle, but something had changed. Nobody complained. A woman nearby quietly moved her bag out of the way. Another passenger stepped back to give the girl more space. Margaret stayed there until the child finally reached for her hand. Together, they walked the last few steps to the seat. Once the girl was sitting down, Margaret helped her fasten the seat belt and showed her where the air vent was. She explained that some people felt better if they focused on one simple thing during takeoff, so she asked the girl to watch Margaret's hand and count slowly to 10 when the plane began moving. It was not a special technique from any manual. It was simply something small the child could control. The flight left only a few minutes late. During takeoff, Margaret passed the row and saw the little girl gripping her father's hand with one hand and counting on her fingers with the other. She was still scared, but she was no longer panicking. Margaret kept walking without saying anything. For the rest of the flight, she found herself thinking about how close she had come to handling the moment the old way. A firm order might have cleared the aisle faster. It also might have turned one frightened child into a screaming one. After landing, Margaret stood near the front as passengers left. She was saying goodbye when the father and his daughter approached. The little girl was carrying a small backpack now and looked completely different from the child who had frozen in the aisle. Before leaving, she gave Margaret a quick hug around the waist and then ran toward the jet bridge. Her father stayed behind for a moment. "Thank you for seeing my daughter before you saw the problem." Margaret felt the words hit her harder than he could have known. She managed a small smile and nodded, but she could not answer right away. As the man walked after his daughter, Margaret turned toward the galley and pretended to straighten a stack of cups. Her eyes were already filling with tears. Months earlier, Shaq had walked away from her because she had seen a problem before she saw the person. Now, without planning it, she had finally done the opposite. Margaret reached into the inside pocket of her uniform and touched the folded letter she still carried with her. For the first time, she understood that Shaq's kindness had not simply saved her from one bad day. It had quietly changed the way she saw everyone who came after him. The story should have been easy to sell. A famous NBA star gets removed from a flight, refuses to attack the employee who made the decision, then quietly asks the airline not to fire her. By the time a reporter learned that part of what had happened, the original anger around the incident was already starting to fade. But this new detail had everything the media liked: conflict, celebrity, surprise, and a clean, emotional ending. A producer reached out to Shaq's team and asked whether he would talk about the letter he had written to Margaret. Another outlet wanted to know if he had personally asked executives to protect her job. Within a day, several people around Shaq were telling him the same thing. If he told the story himself, people would see a side of him they rarely got to see. From a public relations point of view, the opportunity was almost too good. Shaq had been the person embarrassed on the plane, yet he had chosen compassion instead of revenge. His team explained that he did not need to attack Margaret or make the airline look bad. He could simply tell the truth. A short interview could shift the whole story away from the argument over the bag and toward the way he handled it afterward. It could make people respect him even more, and it might also calm some of the anger still directed at Margaret. On paper, there seemed to be almost no downside. Shaq listened, but he kept thinking about why he had written the letter in the first place. He had not written it because he wanted anyone else to read it. He'd written it because he pictured Margaret getting off the plane and realizing that one bad moment had become public before she had time to understand it herself. He wanted one voice to reach her before the angry voices did. If he now read the letter on television or told reporters how hard he had worked to protect her, the private act would become part of his own story. Margaret would once again become the woman who made the mistake, while Shaq became the man praised for forgiving her. That did not feel right. When his team brought up the interview again, Shaq finally explained why he did not want to do it. If I need everybody to know I was kind to her, then it stops being something I gave her and starts becoming something I did for myself. The room became quiet. He was not pretending he had done something heroic. In his mind, he had simply chosen not to make a bad moment worse. Turning that choice into a campaign about his character felt like taking back the very grace he had tried to give. There was another reason he wanted the story left alone. Margaret was finally getting a chance to move forward. The public attention around the flight had started to disappear, and the airline's new training program was taking shape quietly. If Shaq stepped in front of cameras and talked about how he had protected her, her name would be dragged back into headlines. People would argue about whether she deserved forgiveness. Old comments would return. Someone would probably search for her family again. Shaq had already seen how quickly strangers could turn one person's worst few minutes into entertainment. He did not want to restart that machine just because the new version made him look good. Derek Fisher heard about the situation after practice. He did not give Shaq a long speech or try to tell him what the smartest public move would be. He understood that some things became smaller once too many people touched them. Shaq told him that the media wanted the letter and that his team thought sharing it could help his image. Derek listened, then gave him the simplest answer of the day. Then leave it alone. Shaq nodded. That was enough. His team declined the interviews. No copy of the letter was released. No television segment showed Shaq sitting under studio lights explaining how he had forgiven a flight attendant. When reporters asked, his representatives gave a short response saying that Shaq considered the matter finished and did not want anyone losing their job over a disagreement. Without new details to feed it, the story slowly moved out of the headlines. For most people, that was the end of it. For Margaret, it was not. She still carried the letter inside her uniform. She still thought about it when she felt herself making a quick judgment about a passenger. Some days she never touched it. Other days, after a difficult interaction, her fingers would find the folded paper through the fabric of her jacket as if she were reminding herself to wait one more second before deciding what kind of person was standing in front of her. Shaq never knew about most of those moments. He did not know about the frightened little girl Margaret had helped onto a plane. He did not know about the tired mother she later allowed a few extra minutes to calm a crying baby before takeoff. He did not know about the older man who became confused about his connection and expected to be yelled at, only to have Margaret sit beside him and help write the gate number on the back of his boarding pass. None of those moments made the news. That was exactly the point. The letter disappeared from public attention, but its effect did not disappear with it. It kept moving quietly through Margaret's choices, one passenger at a time. And while Shaq believed the story was finished, something else was beginning behind the scenes, something connected to the small support fund he had helped create. Soon, people he had never met would start receiving help because of a decision he had made at an airport gate. The support program started small enough that almost nobody outside the airline knew it existed. At first, it helped a few employees who had been pulled into public complaints or online arguments after difficult moments at work. Then word quietly spread among managers and worker support groups. A hotel receptionist received help after a guest posted a short video that made her look rude without showing the 10 minutes that came before it. A bus driver got assistance after he was suspended during an investigation that later cleared him. A security guard received legal support after a celebrity confrontation turned his name into a headline overnight. None of these people knew Shaq had anything to do with the money. That was exactly how he wanted it. He had made one thing clear from the beginning. The program was not supposed to become another story about Shaquille O'Neal. If someone received help, he wanted them to feel supported, not indebted. He did not want a camera showing up at their home or a reporter asking them what it felt like to be rescued by a famous basketball player. Most of them were already dealing with enough attention. The whole point was to give them a little room to breathe when their lives had suddenly become much bigger than they were prepared for. One case stayed with the people running the program more than the others. A single mother had worked for years at the front desk of a busy hotel. One night, a guest became angry over a reservation problem and recorded part of their argument. The video that went online showed the woman refusing a demand and asking security to step in. It did not show the guest insulting her for several minutes before the recording started. By the next morning, thousands of people were calling her cruel and demanding that the hotel fire her. She was placed on unpaid leave while the company investigated. The woman had a son in middle school and very little savings. Missing even 2 paychecks meant falling behind on rent. It also meant she might have to move to a cheaper neighborhood and pull her son out of the school where he had finally started doing well. The support fund covered part of the gap while the investigation continued. It was not enough money to change her life forever. It was just enough to keep one bad week from destroying everything she had spent years holding together. A month later, the case was closed and she returned to work. The video had already disappeared from most people's feeds by then. The strangers who had spent a day arguing about her had moved on to something else. She never learned who helped cover her expenses, but she asked the program administrator if she could send a thank you note anyway. The card eventually made its way to Shaq. He opened it one evening after practice. The message was short and written in the careful handwriting of someone who had probably rewritten it several times before sending it. Near the end, one sentence made him stop. "Whoever helped me may never know that because of that money, my son didn't have to leave his school." Shaq read the line again. There was no mention of basketball, no request for an autograph, no praise for a celebrity. The woman did not even know his name. She was simply grateful that her son had been able to wake up on Monday morning, put on the same clothes, take the same route, and sit beside the same classmates as if nothing had happened. To most people, that would have looked like an ordinary day. To her, it had almost been taken away. That was when Shaq understood why keeping his name out of the program mattered. If she had known who paid, the story might have become about him. Instead, it remained about her son staying in school and a family making it through a difficult month. That felt closer to what he had wanted from the beginning. He carried the card home and stood for a moment near the old travel bag he had used on the flight from Orlando. Eli's basketball was no longer inside. Shaq had signed it, added a message, and made sure it was shipped back safely to the boy. A few weeks later, Eli's mother had sent a photograph of him holding the ball against his chest with a smile so wide that Shaq had kept the picture too. Now the bag held something different. Shaq placed the thank you card inside next to Eli's original letter. Over time, other notes began appearing. A hotel worker wrote that the help kept her electricity on. A security employee wrote that his wife had stopped crying once they learned they could afford an attorney. A bus driver sent a simple message saying he had been able to keep groceries in the house while waiting to return to work. None of them knew the same man was reading their words. Shaq never answered those letters directly. He did not want to break the distance that made the help feel clean. But he kept them. The old duffel had once carried a child's basketball that Shaq was afraid to lose. Now it was slowly filling with proof that one difficult moment at an airport had reached people he would probably never meet. And somewhere in those letters, the story was becoming bigger than Margaret, bigger than the airline, and bigger than Shaq himself. 6 months had passed since the flight, and Margaret had stopped expecting the story to follow her forever. The calls from reporters had ended. The angry messages had slowed down. At work, people had mostly stopped looking at her like they were waiting for her to explain herself. She had finished the new training program and gone back to flying her regular schedule. To anyone watching from the outside, life had returned to normal. But Margaret knew she was not the same woman who had stood beside seat 1A that morning. She still carried Shaq's letter inside her uniform jacket. The paper was beginning to soften along the folds because she had opened it so many times. Some days she read it before a difficult flight. Other days she only touched the envelope through the fabric when she felt herself becoming impatient. It had become a quiet reminder to slow down before deciding who someone was. Margaret never told anyone how much that letter had changed the way she worked. She did not want to make a performance out of it. In a strange way, she felt Shaq would have understood that. One afternoon, after finishing a flight into Orlando, Margaret's supervisor asked her to stay for a few minutes. There was nothing unusual in her tone, so Margaret assumed it was about scheduling. Instead, the supervisor closed the office door and told her something she had not been expected to hear. The conflict resolution program had not simply been created because the airline wanted to improve training. Shaq had pushed for it. He had also quietly helped fund a separate program that supported frontline workers whose lives were suddenly thrown into chaos after public incidents. Margaret stared at her supervisor, trying to understand why no one had told her earlier. She knew Shaq had asked the airline to treat her fairly. She knew about the letter. But this was different. He had taken what happened between them and turned it into something that could help people he would never meet. He had done it without attaching his name to the program, without giving interviews, and without asking anyone to praise him for it. Her first reaction was not gratitude, it was suspicion. "What does he want from me?" The supervisor shook her head. "Nothing." That answer stayed in the room. Margaret waited for something else. An invitation to a charity event, a request for a public apology, a chance for Shaq to bring her on stage and show the world that he had forgiven her. But there was nothing. He had not asked for a meeting, a photograph, or even a thank you note. The supervisor explained that he had been very clear about that from the beginning. He wanted the program to exist because the next person caught in a public storm might not have anyone powerful enough to ask for fairness. That was the part Margaret was not prepared for. For months, she had thought the most generous thing Shaq had done was protect her. Now she realized she had been looking at the story too narrowly. He had not built the program because Margaret Hale was special. He had built it because she was not. She was one employee among thousands who stood between company rules and tired, angry, frightened customers every day. One day there would be another Margaret, maybe a hotel clerk dealing with an angry guest, maybe a security guard making a decision in a crowded hallway, maybe a bus driver trying to enforce a policy while someone pointed a phone at his face. Shaq had looked beyond the person who hurt him and seen an entire group of people who could one day make the same kind of mistake. Margaret drove home in silence. That evening, she placed her purse on the kitchen counter and sat at the small table near the window. It was the same table where she had first searched Shaq's name after the flight, trying to understand the man she had asked to leave. Back then, she had been afraid of what his fame could do to her life. Now she was trying to understand why he had used that same fame to protect people who would never know his name was attached to the help they received. She took the letter from her jacket and laid it on the table. For a long time, she simply looked at it. Then she called her daughter. Margaret told Rachel everything she had learned. She explained the support program, the training, and the fact that Shaq had kept his involvement quiet. Rachel listened without interrupting. There had been a time when Margaret would have used the conversation to defend herself again, to explain the rule, the bag, the policy, and why she had made the decision she did. This time, she did not. Instead, Margaret admitted something she had been slowly realizing for months. "I spent so many years trying to do everything correctly that somewhere along the way, I forgot the person standing in front of me wasn't a rule." Rachel stayed silent. Margaret looked down at the letter. She remembered the frightened little girl on the plane and the way the child's hand had stopped shaking when Margaret knelt beside her. She remembered the father thanking her for seeing his daughter before seeing the problem. None of that would have happened if Margaret had walked away from the incident with Shaq believing only that she had been embarrassed by a celebrity. She took a breath. "He didn't save my job," Margaret said. "He saved the part of me I'd let this job make hard." Her voice broke on the last few words. Rachel did not rush to answer. When she finally spoke, she told her mother that maybe the reason the experience hurt so much was because it had forced her to see something she had been too busy to notice. Margaret knew she was right. Years of dealing with difficult passengers had taught her how to protect herself, but somewhere along the way, that protection had become distance. She had become so good at identifying problems that she sometimes stopped seeing people before the problem was solved. After the call, Margaret stayed at the kitchen table long after the room had grown dark. The letter remained open in front of her. For the first time, she no longer saw it as proof that Shaq had forgiven her. She saw it as an invitation to become someone different. The next morning, she put the letter back inside her uniform jacket and went to work. But something had changed again. Margaret no longer carried it because she was afraid of becoming the woman from Seat 1A. She carried it because she wanted to remember the kind of person she had chosen to become after that day. Margaret's final day as a flight attendant began almost exactly like hundreds of others. She arrived early, checked her schedule twice, pinned her name badge in place, and stood for a moment in front of the mirror in the employee restroom. The uniform looked the same, but everything about wearing it felt different. By the end of the day, she would take it off and never put it on again. There would be no next flight, no next safety briefing, no next passenger waiting at the gate. After years of building her life around departure times and boarding calls, Margaret was about to walk away from the job that had shaped her more than she wanted to admit. Before leaving the restroom, she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. Shaq's letter was still there. The paper had yellowed with age, and the folds were so worn that she had reinforced one of them with a thin strip of clear tape. She no longer read the letter every week the way she once had. She didn't need to. She remembered the words well enough. What mattered now was simply knowing it was there, a small reminder of the day she had been forced to look at herself honestly. The flight itself was supposed to be easy. Short route, clear weather, no major delays. Margaret moved through the cabin with the calm confidence of someone who had done the same job for years. She helped an older woman lift a suitcase, found space for a stroller, and brought a cup of water to a nervous teenager before takeoff. None of those moments felt special. That was what Margaret had learned over time. Most acts of patience did not look important when they happened. They simply made another person's difficult day a little easier. About halfway through the flight, a man near the front became angry. His connecting flight had been changed, and he believed he was going to miss an important family event. By the time Margaret reached him, his voice was loud enough that several passengers had turned around. He demanded answers Margaret did not have and blamed her for decisions made by people hundreds of miles away. Years earlier, she would have responded with facts. She would have explained the policy, the limits of her responsibility, and exactly what he needed to do after landing. All of it would have been correct. Margaret felt that old response rise inside her. Then she paused. She noticed the man's hand shaking as he held his phone. On the screen was a photograph of an elderly woman in a hospital bed. Suddenly, his anger looked different. It was still uncomfortable. It was still unfair to direct it at her. But now, Margaret could see the fear underneath it. She lowered her voice and said, "It sounds like today has been very hard for you. Let me see if there's one part of it I can make easier." The man stopped talking. For a moment, he looked embarrassed. Then he explained that his mother had been taken to the hospital that morning and that he was trying to reach her before surgery. His connection was now so tight that he was afraid he would miss the last flight home. Margaret could not promise to fix everything, but she could contact the gate team, ask them to note the situation, and help him get off the aircraft quickly after landing. It was not much, but it was something. The man sat down. The rest of the cabin slowly returned to normal. As Margaret walked back toward the galley, she thought about how differently that moment might have gone years earlier. The old Margaret would have seen a passenger raising his voice and responded to the behavior first. The woman she had become had learned to look one step deeper. She had not become softer about safety or less serious about her job. She had simply learned that understanding the reason behind someone's behavior could sometimes solve a problem faster than correcting the behavior itself. When the plane landed, the gate team was already waiting. The man was allowed to leave first. Before stepping into the jet bridge, he turned back toward Margaret. His face looked completely different from the angry face she had seen 20 minutes earlier. "Thank you for not treating me like I was just some difficult passenger." Margaret smiled. She told him she hoped he made it to his mother in time. Then he was gone. One by one, the remaining passengers left the aircraft. Some thanked Margaret. Most simply walked past, already thinking about baggage claim, rides home, or whatever waited for them next. Margaret had always liked that about airplanes. People entered carrying entire lives she knew nothing about, shared a small space for a few hours, and then disappeared into different directions. Eventually, the cabin was empty. Margaret stood near the front for a while, listening to the quiet. No voices, no rolling suitcases, no overhead announcements, just rows of empty seats and afternoon light coming through the windows. She walked slowly down the aisle, touching the top of a seat here and there as memories came back to her. Difficult flights, kind passengers, long nights, her first day in uniform, the frightened little girl who had once taken her hand, and finally, seat 1A. She stopped there. For several seconds, Margaret simply looked at the seat. Then she sat down. She reached into her jacket and took out Shaq's letter. The envelope was soft now, the corners rounded from years of being carried. Margaret did not open it. She had read it enough. Instead, she placed it on her lap and rested one hand over it. For years, she had thought the most important thing Shaq gave her was forgiveness. Sitting there on her final flight, she understood that it had been something else. He had given her time. Time to be wrong without being destroyed. Time to see herself clearly. Time to change. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about how different her career might have ended if that day in seat 1A had become only a punishment. Maybe she would have spent years defending herself. Maybe she would have become even harder. Instead, one man had responded to her worst professional moment by leaving enough space for her to become better afterward. Margaret stood, placed the letter back inside her jacket, and walked off the aircraft for the last time. There were hugs in the employee area, a small cake, a few photographs. Someone made a joke about how she would finally stop checking the time every 5 minutes. Margaret laughed with everyone else, but part of her mind was already on something she had been planning for weeks. Before leaving the airport, she walked toward a mailbox near the terminal exit. From her purse, she removed a plain white envelope. Inside was a letter she had written and rewritten several times. There was no request for a meeting, no request for forgiveness, no attempt to reopen the story that both of them had allowed to fade quietly. There was only something Margaret had needed to say for years. She looked at the name written on the front one last time. Shaquille O'Neal. Then she dropped the envelope into the mailbox. For the first time since the day she asked him to leave seat 1A, Margaret was the one sending the letter, and she had no idea when or if Shaq would ever read what was inside. Years had passed since the flight, and Shaq's life had changed in almost every visible way. Basketball was no longer his full-time job. The packed arenas had been replaced by television studios, bright lights, makeup chairs, production meetings, and the familiar back and forth he shared with Ernie Johnson and Charles Barkley. Shaq had become comfortable in that world too. He could joke before the cameras came on, argue about basketball for 10 minutes, then laugh about it the moment they went to commercial. But every now and then, something from his old life found its way into the studio and reminded him that not every important moment had happened on a court. One evening, not long before they were scheduled to go live, Ernie walked into the room holding a plain envelope. It had been forwarded through several offices before reaching the studio, and the handwriting on the front looked careful and old-fashioned. Ernie glanced at the name, then handed it to Shaq without making a big deal out of it. Shaq almost set it aside with the rest of the mail, but something about the handwriting made him stop. The return name in the corner was one he had not seen in years: Margaret Hale. For a moment, Shaq simply stared at it. He remembered the airplane immediately. Seat 1A, the duffel bag, the quiet cabin. The look on Margaret's face after someone behind him whispered his name. He remembered walking off the plane with Eli's basketball still inside the bag, then sitting near the gate and writing a letter he had never expected to hear about again. Over the years, he had occasionally wondered what happened to Margaret, but he had never tried to find her. He had wanted the space he gave her to remain real. If she changed, it had to be because she chose to, not because Shaq kept showing up to remind her of the worst day of her career. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter several pages long. Margaret began by telling him she had recently retired. She wrote about her final flight, about standing in an empty cabin after the passengers had left, and about stopping for a few minutes beside seat 1A, even though it had been on a different aircraft and a different route. Then came the line that made Shaq lean back in his chair. "You probably don't remember me anymore, but there wasn't a single working day after that flight when I completely forgot you." Shaq kept reading. Margaret told him that for years she had carried his original letter inside her uniform. At first, she carried it because she was ashamed. Later, she carried it because it reminded her to pause before deciding what kind of person was standing in front of her. She wrote about a frightened little girl who froze in the aisle during boarding and how, instead of ordering the child to move, Margaret knelt beside her and helped her breathe. She wrote about an angry man trying to get home to his mother before surgery and how she had finally learned to hear fear beneath anger. None of those moments were dramatic enough for the news, she wrote, but they were the moments that changed the way she understood her job. Shaq slowed down as he reached the middle of the letter. Margaret admitted that for years she had believed doing the job correctly meant applying rules the same way every time. She still believed rules mattered, but she had come to understand that people did too. A good employee could follow policy and still miss what was happening right in front of them. A person could be correct about a rule and still be wrong about another human being. She wrote that the flight had forced her to see that difference, but his response afterward was what gave her the courage to admit it. Then Shaq reached the sentence that stopped him. "You didn't make me better by proving I was wrong. You changed me by giving me enough grace to discover for myself that I could become better." He stopped reading. Charles was sitting nearby, looking through notes for the show, and noticed Shaq had gone quiet. He started to say something, probably a joke about Shaq getting emotional over fan mail, but then he saw Shaq's face and let the words die before they came out. Ernie noticed too. Neither man asked what the letter said. Shaq lowered his head and rubbed one hand across his face. For years, he had thought of that day as a small choice. He had been angry, but he chose not to use his fame to punish Margaret. He had written a letter because his mother had reminded him not to let someone else's bad moment decide his next one. He had helped create a support program because Philip Harrison had taught him that real strength was about what you chose not to do with power. At the time, none of it had felt like something that would last. It had felt like a way to keep one ugly moment from getting uglier. Margaret's letter told him otherwise. She wrote that Shaq had never known how many passengers benefited from the decision he made at that gate. He would never know their names because she did not remember all of them herself. They were ordinary people on ordinary days, nervous children, exhausted parents, elderly travelers, people dealing with grief, people who were rude because they were scared, and sometimes people who were simply difficult. Margaret had not become perfect. She had still made mistakes, but she had learned to pause before turning a person into a problem. Near the end of the letter, she wrote about her final flight. An angry passenger had shouted at her because he was afraid he would miss a connection and fail to reach his mother before surgery. Years earlier, Margaret would have responded with rules. Instead, she noticed the hospital photo on his phone and asked what part of the situation she could help with. The man later thanked her for not treating him like just another difficult passenger. Margaret wrote that she had gone home after that flight and realized something she had needed years to understand. "The kindness you showed me did not end with me." Shaq read that sentence twice. The studio around him continued moving. Producers walked past. Someone counted down the minutes until air. A television monitor played highlights with the sound turned low. But Shaq barely noticed any of it. He was thinking about an airport gate years earlier, a plain sheet of paper, and a decision that had seemed almost too small to matter. Ernie stepped closer and placed a hand on Shaq's shoulder. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. Charles stayed quiet too, which might have been the clearest sign of all that both men understood the moment belonged to Shaq. Shaq folded Margaret's letter slowly and returned it to the envelope. His eyes were wet, but he smiled as he looked down at her name. He had spent most of his life receiving applause for things everyone could see: dunks, championships, television, business deals. Yet one of the things that now meant the most to him had happened in an airport chair with no crowd, no cameras, and no guarantee that the woman receiving his letter would ever forgive herself. A producer called out that they had 2 minutes before going live. Shaq put Margaret's envelope safely inside his jacket. He thought the story had ended years ago. Now he knew it had been living quietly in people he would never meet. And when the cameras came on that night, no one watching at home knew that Shaq was carrying a letter against his chest that had taken years to find its way back to him. Shaq got home late that night, but he did not go straight to bed. Margaret's letter was still inside his jacket, folded carefully the same way he had received it at the studio. For most of the drive home, he had thought about the strange path that had brought it back to him. Years earlier, he had written one page in an airport because he did not want an angry moment to destroy someone else's life. He had never expected an answer. He had never expected that Margaret would carry his words through the rest of her career. Now her letter sat against his chest, proof that something he almost considered small had stayed alive long after the headlines were gone. He walked into a storage room and pulled an old travel bag from the back of a shelf. The same bag had gone through airports, hotels, buses, locker rooms, and more cities than he could remember. The leather was worn around the handles and one zipper had been repaired years ago. Shaq had kept it because it held things he did not want mixed in with trophies, framed jerseys, or other reminders of his public life. Inside were notes from children, thank you cards from families, old photographs, and pieces of ordinary paper that meant more to him than anything expensive ever could. He sat on the floor and started going through them. There was the note from the hotel worker whose son had been able to stay in his school. There was another from a bus driver who had kept food on the table while waiting for his job to be restored. There were letters from children who had met Shaq once and still remembered the day years later. None of them were polished. Some were written in pencil. Some had spelling mistakes. Some had been folded so many times that the edges were nearly gone. Shaq had kept them because they reminded him of people who had no reason to impress anyone. Near the bottom of the bag, he found a small white envelope. Eli. Shaq smiled before he even opened it. He could still see that little boy standing in the Orlando gym, holding his father's old basketball against his chest and looking unsure about whether to trust anyone with it. Shaq remembered promising to send it back. He remembered how careful he had been with the bag because that ball was inside. Most of all, he remembered the words Eli had written about strength. At the time, Shaq thought the boy was simply repeating something his mother had taught him. Years later, those words felt like the beginning of everything that followed. He unfolded Eli's letter and placed it on the table. Then he took Margaret's letter from his jacket and placed it beside it. For a while, Shaq simply looked at the two pieces of paper. One had been written by a little boy who wanted to grow up strong but had been taught that strength meant having a big heart first. The other had been written by a woman who once saw Shaq as a problem before she saw the person in front of her, then spent years trying not to make that mistake again with anyone else. Neither of them knew the other existed, yet somehow their words belonged together. Shaq leaned back in his chair and let out a quiet laugh. For most of his life, people had talked about his strength in numbers, his height, his weight, how much he could lift, how hard he could dunk, how many defenders it took to stop him, but none of that had helped him at the airport gate. In that moment, the hardest thing had been much simpler, deciding what to do when he had every reason to be angry. He thought again about Margaret's final line. The kindness you showed me did not end with me. That was the part Shaq had never seen. He had thought he was protecting one woman from one bad day. He had not known that years later she would kneel beside a frightened child instead of ordering her to move. He had not known she would listen to an angry passenger long enough to hear the fear underneath his voice. He had not known that people he would never meet would be treated differently because of a letter he had written while waiting for another flight. Shaq picked up his phone and called his mother. Lucille answered with the familiar tone that made him feel, even after all these years, like the same son who used to call home when something was bothering him. Shaq told her he had received a letter from Margaret. He told her what Margaret had written about carrying his words through the rest of her career and how she believed that his response had changed the way she treated people. Then he reminded Lucille of the phone call they had shared years earlier at the airport. "Mom, do you remember telling me not to let somebody else's 5 bad minutes decide who I became in my next 5? Lucille laughed softly. "I told you a lot of things. So you finally listened to one of them?" Shaq laughed too. It was the kind of laugh that released something he had been carrying all evening. They talked for a few more minutes, mostly about ordinary things, before saying goodnight. When the call ended, Shaq stayed where he was. He looked down at Eli's letter, then Margaret's. Two people from completely different parts of his life had reminded him of the same lesson in different ways. Eli had asked, without knowing it, what kind of strong man Shaq wanted to be. Margaret had answered years later by showing him what one choice could become once another person carried it forward. Shaq folded both letters carefully. He placed them next to each other inside the old travel bag. Then he closed the zipper. The bag had once mattered because of what Shaq was afraid to lose. Now it mattered because of what had been added to it. That day on the airplane, Shaquille O'Neal had enough money to buy every seat in the cabin. He had enough fame to put one employee's career under a spotlight. He had enough influence to turn a small disagreement into something that could follow Margaret for the rest of her life. If he had chosen anger, people probably would have understood. Some would even have applauded him for it. But that was not the choice that lasted. What lasted was a plain sheet of paper. What lasted was a woman getting another chance. What lasted was a frightened child being treated gently years later. What lasted was a mother keeping her son in the same school because a quiet program helped her through one terrible month. And what lasted was a letter that came back to Shaq years after he had stopped expecting anything in return. Sometimes strength is loud. Sometimes it fills an arena, breaks through defenders, and makes thousands of people stand up at once. But sometimes real strength is much quieter. It is having the power to embarrass someone and choosing not to. It is being hurt without needing to hurt someone back. It is understanding that a person's worst moment may be real, but it does not have to become their whole life. And sometimes the strongest person in the room is simply the one who has every reason to take someone's dignity away and chooses to leave it with them.